Welcome to the Thought Diaries, a podcast dedicated to mental health, neuroscience and trauma. I'm your host, Roxanne, owner of Helix Trauma Training and founder of Trauma Healing UK. Today I'm joined by Malcolm Currie from Strathesk Resolutions. Hi Malcolm.
Hi there, Roxanne. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. The rain's coming and going a little bit, but that it could be worse.
Oh no, I was absolutely pouring this morning, and taking the dogs out, it was just getting soaked.
Yeah.
So I think what we're kind of going to chat about is conflict, because it's something that we deal with every day in our lives. And you obviously specialise in dealing with conflict within relationships. Why do you think conflict occurs?
Ooh, that's a nice small question to start.
I know,
with.
sorry, Malcolm.
I think it's worth starting from the point of view that most of the relationships that I'm dealing with where there's conflict are ones in the workplace or to do with things that people are doing about business. Although the reason that people have conflicts, I think, generally comes down to the same set of things. But one I think is actually at the core of most conflicts, and I would say that is communication.
Yeah.
And if people are communicating effectively, they are much, much less likely to end up in a conflict. That's not to say that they're not going to disagree, but it's how you disagree and whether that spills over into being a conflict.
Yeah, definitely. I think communication is so important. And we've briefly discussed before how we all have our innate biases, and that can be quite triggering, because throughout our entire life we have built our identity, and without our identity we question, well, where is the meaning in the world? What does the world mean? And that becomes a threat. And when we are in a relationship, whether that be work, personal life, romantic relationship, when someone comes along and proposes an idea or a thought towards us that doesn't align with our identity, that can be quite triggering. And I'm sure you see this all the time, that we often, our first reaction is to put those defenses up.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's so difficult to predict what's going to be a trigger for somebody.
Yes.
Because it could be almost anything. And it's actually very possible that that individual doesn't know that it's a trigger for them as well.
Yeah. I mean, and that we see that in politics all the time. When certainly, I don't know what your thoughts are on this in terms of extreme left wing and extreme right wing, is they have create their identity around a political figure or a political notion, and for someone to come along and question that it's more than just questioning the ideology, it's questioning them and their understanding of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you're getting into there is the whole thing around cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. If you're really bought into a political concept or a belief system, then generally you will look for things to confirm that that is the case, which means you can actually end up ignoring really, really powerful evidence that it's not true. Because you see one little thing within what you're seeing that confirms to you what you already believe to be the case. And I think that's a big, big issue in the world at the moment. There's an awful lot of people who are not aware of that whole concept, that they're having their biases confirmed by the way that they are interpreting what they're seeing.
Yeah, and then someone comes along and questions that your belief system, and naturally they then become the enemy, and then conflict arises. That this is how I believe the world is right. This is how it is. I have evidence that this is it is, and the cognitive dissonance. I can't integrate what you're saying, and then the person on the other side is doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the example that I would maybe point to in that is I've always, my background is as a scientist, and I started out, I did a degree in zoology, and I worked in nature conservation, but I still view the world kind of through the eyes of a scientist, even though I've not worked in that area for a very long time now. But looking at that, I have become as uncomfortable over the years with people who are fundamentalist scientists as I am with anybody who has any other fundamentalist belief. So the belief that science can explain everything starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, because actually, if it's trying to explain everything, can we actually understand what it's trying to explain? And and it does tend to get sort of fairly theological at that stage. But yes, I mean, it's one of those areas that then can lead to not having the space to listen to somebody else's point of view if you've got such a strongly held viewpoint and are looking for things to confirm that you're correct. And as soon as you stop listening, then the communication starts to break down.
Yes, and we do all do it, because as you say, we all have our own perceptions, our own lensy experience, and I find myself doing it all the time on social media. I mean, through my training as a counsellor, a big part of it is self-awareness. So I'd say that I have a pretty good grasp on it, and I can kind of see it. But I will sometimes go on social media and I will find myself getting quite angry. How can you say that? That's a load of rubbish. I luckily can catch myself before I go down on a whole rampage and questioning their beliefs.
I mean, I have to say that's partly why I don't use social media very much. I mean, I use LinkedIn because it's it's a good business tool. But an awful lot of the things that I see on Twitter, on Facebook, and everything have no room in what's being said to listen to what the alternative viewpoint might be.
Exactly. And it's all fear-based, because our identity keeps us safe. I think I spoke about that earlier. And my work isn't too different in terms of I'm not dealing with conflict between two people. I'm dealing with an inner conflict that contrasts and can't fit in. So, for example, someone who is brought up thinking their families, you have to be academic to be successful. You have to go to university. That's so important. So that's a value that you've learned, but you grow up and actually realize that you're not academic. And that's where your genetics come in, that you just maybe don't possess that kind of brain that either enjoys it or works with it. So that causes massively inner conflict. And that's kind of where therapy kind of branches differently, because that needs a lot of deep work, but it's the same kind of thing, because you're unpicking where that comes from.
I mean, it's interesting because as you say, the situations I'm dealing with are with two or more people who are involved in a disagreement with each other. But no, I can completely see what you're saying, that actually the arguments that we have with ourselves, and especially the ones that we lose, actually could cause us a real problem. So how do we actually create that space to listen to ourselves and to have space for actually to have, is it wrong to be in two minds about a decision that you need to make? You will have, if you're in two minds, the reason that expression exists is because you're arguing inside your head that well, these things are in favor of it, these things are against it. But are you actually going back to the basic principles of what your needs are
Exactly.
in terms of all of that?
And I actually think that most people come to see me, and actually a huge, not all mental health conditions or mental health difficulties, but deep rooted in that inner conflict. And that's where kind of shame and anxiety comes from, because they're taught that value is on being academic, but they're not academic, so therefore they're not good.
Yes.
And that massive inner conflict. So a bit like relationship conflict is what happens is often denial, that
Yeah.
kind of shutting off from the shame, and
Mm.
trying in a way to integrate it. But
Hmm.
unlike a relationship where you can't leave the room, all that's happening is you
Yeah.
just shut your emotions internally, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, as you're talking, of course, what I'm doing is I'm doing a comparison sort of
Mm-hmm.
back to, back to a situation where I'm, perhaps mediating between two parties, or perhaps trying to help them do a negotiation.
Yeah.
Which are things that I'll do. And the thing that was coming to me, that just as you were saying that, and it relates back to what I just said a few minutes ago about need.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things that very often triggers these disagreements, yes, it's listening is underpinning it, but very often what's not being listened to is actually the person themselves,
Mm-hmm.
or the group themselves,
Mm-hmm.
as to what they need. So, for
Yes.
example, when I'm helping two parties, whether it's an organization in the workforce, or whether it's two individuals, or if it's a community group that are disagreeing between themselves, to help each one of those parties understand what their own needs are is
Mm-hmm.
often the starting point for them to start then opening to what the needs of the other party are.
Yeah.
So
Uh-huh.
so if you take away the other party part of that, if people, when they're interacting with other human beings, are very poor at knowing what their own needs are. I know
Mm-hmm.
what I want, but
Mm-hmm.
is it what I need?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If they're that bad at identifying what their needs are when they're dealing with other people, how are they going to be at identifying what their needs are when they're dealing with themselves?
Yes, and our needs are often growing up, can be installed and learned
Mm,
from someone else. So it's not our true needs, it's what someone else
yes,
is telling us what we need. And that causes
yes.
another layer of
Yeah.
inner conflict, but also makes it more difficult to resolve conflict with others.
Yes, yes. I mean, the thing that comes to mind there is, I remember a few years ago reading a survey report that had come out
Mm-hmm.
that was indicating that one of the underlying causes of obesity in the Western world was that so many people mistake thirst for hunger.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So they wake up and they're sort of thinking, oh, their stomach's feeling empty or something in the middle of the night, and they get up and they go and have a snack. And actually, what their body was telling them was, you need fluid, you need
Mm-hmm.
water. But they wake up and they think, I want a sandwich.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
What they want overrides what they actually need. And then, of course, their stomach's full, so their body kind of
Mm-hmm.
forgets because it's got work to do on digesting that. But it means that I think that survey was suggesting that more than 70% of the Western world is chronically dehydrated because they
Yeah.
misinterpret their body telling them that they're thirsty as
Mm-hmm.
hunger.
Yeah, no, I've read that as well. And I probably make that mistake, but I'm not quite at that stage where I have to worry about
I'm
it.
going to have a drink now.
I am better at
Mm,
drinking water, but it's
mm,
and needs needs is such a complicated thing.
yeah.
But I think our body does tell us what we need.
Yeah.
It really does, because there's all this subconscious stuff. So you've got kind of what's been enforced on you, or you need this, you need to do that. Um,
Yeah.
but we are still governed by innate, I don't know, genetics or personality traits that
Mm,
subconsciously it does know what we need. Yeah.
yes.
And
Yeah.
if you look at like
Well,
Maslow's hierarchy,
yes. Yeah. I mean, I think does it know? I mean, there are a series of triggers,
mm-hmm.
and the trouble is at the head of all of these triggers, in the head, is our brain. And unfortunately, our brain, through our life experiences, learns to misinterpret things,
Yeah.
or
See,
to ignore certain things, or
uh,
to decide something different to what's
yeah.
going on.
No, I agree with that. I think when I said that our brain knows, I mean on like a
Mm,
subconscious level, we cognitively might not know
yes.
it, but our body gives signals through, for
Yeah.
example, I feel hungry, or physiology is telling
Yeah.
us that we need to put something in our body.
Yeah.
Um, And it maybe, and a lot of the work I do actually is more listening to our bodies.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is, that immediately makes me sort of think there's a whole comparison conversation to be had there about one of the fundamentals of particularly the mediation, but also negotiation work that I do, which is active listening.
yeah.
So if you've got two people interacting with each other and they actively listen to each other, then they will be open to hearing more. They will listen with curiosity. Now, yes, are you listening to your body? Are you curious about what your body is telling you?
Yeah.
So, for example, that person waking up in the middle of the night, feeling, oh, right, I need to put something into my stomach. If you actually listen to your body and ask it a couple of questions, maybe it'll tell you, actually, you need liquid, you don't need food. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like with trauma, often what happens with trauma is the front part of the cognitive, logical part of the brain,
Yeah.
the rational
Yeah.
thought does shut down, and it
Yeah.
often does manifest physically. But we ignore physical symptoms, we brush them
Yes.
off, but the conflict comes up physically, either tense
Yeah.
in the shoulders, tightness in the
Yeah.
stomach, and
Yeah.
I think it's great once you start to recognize the physical symptoms, you then can work backwards to start to unpick it. Actually, how do you feel? Why do you feel like this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, over the years, I've dealt with several people who have ended up with chronic back problems, which they tried all sorts of things to do with, the ergonomics of their workstation and all this kind of thing. But they actually turned out to be stress related. And were manifestations of mental problems, not, when I say problems, that sound too big, but mental, not completely healthy.
Yes,
Yeah.
But I love what you said about curiosity, and I think that should be the cornerstone of everything. Always be curious.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you're open into learning as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd say the two things: listen with curiosity. But the other one that I find quite useful as a maxim, when I'm training people on how to mediate or to negotiate, is to listen with kindness.
Yeah.
Now, especially if it's with somebody that you're disagreeing with, if you listen with kindness, then you're much more likely to hear the need that's underneath what they're saying to you. And they're much more likely to open up to you as well and actually start talking as a human being rather than having an argument.
Yeah, and I think I maybe class that as empathy. That kind of just opening up what is going on for that other person. And I was on a training course on stress management and crisis, and the tutor mentioned perspective taking.
Right.
I really like that because often empathy we do.
So what do they mean by perspective taking?
So it's empathy can be, you can lead to burnout with empathy because it has a very emotional kind of element of I can feel your pain with you.
Yes.
Well, perspective taking is much more boundaried, and that just what's going on for this other person? What must they be feeling?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. I don't know if you've ever come across a book called Getting Past No by William Ury. And it's basically looking at how you get beyond deadlock in a negotiation situation. But one of the fundamental steps in that he describes as go to the balcony.
Right.
So if you move to the balcony, you get a different view of the dispute. And it sounds very, very similar, actually.
Yeah, it is that. I noticed that the other day because I've got a field next to me where I walk the dogs, and I always walk in the same direction. Always, I'm just that type of person. But there was deer at the bottom of it, so I decided to walk in the opposite direction, and it did. It was completely different. It was the same field, but I got a different feeling in my body as well. I was recognizing that this was something different. And to begin with, it was slightly uncomfortable. I'm like, this isn't what I normally do. I know it's just a field. but this is a strange feeling, a sensation,
Yeah.
because it's different.
Yes.
But once you start walking around, you do realize it is just a field.
Yeah, but it's that thing of going beyond your comfort zone. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
basic example. But when we look at conflict, then
yeah,
is that
yeah.
changing our perspective, and it's
Mm,
slightly uncomfortable because it's unknown. It's going against what we learn, what we know about
yeah.
ourselves.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
but
Interesting. I mean, to be honest, I've never really thought about the parallels between external conflict and
uh-huh,
internal conflict. So it's actually really an interesting area to get into a discussion about. I think actually links back to the book that triggered the conversation, which is
uh-huh,
Tim Hicks' book, Embodied Conflict.
mm-hmm,
Because the whole thing that I took from that book was actually about the physiological basis
yeah,
for how people react when they're in conflict.
mm-hmm,
But that must be as important, if not more important, when you're talking about particularly trauma.
mm-hmm,
Because presumably one of the key things with trauma is something triggers a reaction, but that reaction is the fight, flight, or
yeah,
freeze
mm-hmm,
kind of reaction, which
yeah,
is the same one that that I have to deal with in
yes,
either negotiation or
mm-hmm,
more often in a mediation situation,
mm-hmm,
where somebody has an emotional response to something, and then they have to deal with this flood of cortisol, the adrenaline's up, and actually their higher brain functions stop working.
yeah, and
So
and I mean, because you've got two types of, I guess, defined trauma. You've got PTSD, which is
yeah,
your reaction. Something happens, you have that fight or flight. You learn that, so you learn that that's a dangerous thing, so you shut off.
yeah,
But then
yes,
complex PTSD, which is often stems from like childhood sexual abuse, is much more relational, and it actually is
okay.
much more likely to has more similarities with the work that you're doing.
Yes. Okay. So
Um,
the triggers are much more based by interactions with other people.
Interactions with other people, but
Yeah.
also the internal relationship in that person
Yes.
between what they've taught, what they've learned about the world, and actually what's
Yes.
happened to them and how they
Right.
feel. There's like a
Yes.
conflict. So like an example, it's not necessarily complex PTSD, but when we're told that anger's bad,
Mm. Yeah.
we have learned that that's part of
Yeah.
our social cultural identity. But when we
Yeah.
feel anger, we have no control over that feeling. So we
Mm.
go, right, there's a conflict. I am angry, but anger's
Mm.
bad.
Yeah.
So like a person having conflict with someone else, they just
Yeah.
kind of put a defense up, and usually
Yes.
within that
Yes.
internal, it's shutting down.
Yeah.
But it's also
Absolutely.
what happens is anxiety manifests because it's an internal threat. You can't see the
Yes.
threat, but it is a
Yes.
threat.
Yes, absolutely. And the crazy thing about all of that is that anger isn't bad. It's
No.
what you do with it
Hmm.
that could be bad.
Yeah.
That's yeah, yeah,
But we're
absolutely.
taught, you must see that
Yeah.
within relationship conflicts as well, is anger is such a, it is such a cultural problem that
Mm,
we don't feel comfortable as a culture expressing it.
yes.
So that you might get passive aggression and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely, absolutely. But it sounds like you're getting demanded to have some attention given in the background there. I can hear
I
just little
am, I
noises from the
am.
dog.
I had shut them out,
Yeah.
but they know how to open doors.
Ah, right.
So
Okay.
currently one is just licking the face of the other one.
All right. Okay. Okay. Well, at least that's not leading to any anger reactions.
No, not yet.
But,
And
yeah.
they're not angry, which is good. I think
Yeah.
though, that reading that book, Embodied Conflict, I think it
Mm,
really prompted me to think about a lot of stuff, and I
yeah.
got so much from it.
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah.
glad that you recommended reading it.
No, no, no problem. I mean, I actually sort of read it because Tim Hicks was invited over by a mediator colleague of mine, John Sturrock. He quite often invites people who've got big stories to tell to do sessions for his company. And so Tim came over and did a presentation about what was in his book. And it was wonderful to have an opportunity to just have a conversation with him about how it underpinned his thought processes and how I could actually then adapt the knowledge I already had of physiology from studying zoology, and adapt that in with the practices of particular mediation, but also approaches to negotiation and generally where people are disagreeing about things. And I'd never really connected them together before. So, I found it an absolutely fascinating book to just go through, and it collects a whole series of different bits of research and just makes the connections between them, which I thought was really useful, which turns, I think, particularly the second half of the book into a very practical guide almost as to how you use those bits of information.
It was the second half that probably didn't relate too much to me, but that first half I thought was really, really good. I mean, I think there's so much to come out of this, and I think there's so much further exploration about this. But I guess for people who are listening to this podcast, maybe it's just the takeaway messages for kind of that more in-depth self-reflection, that more listening with kindness and listening with curiosity, and see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, listening is so fundamental to life and getting on with each other. And actually, we're generally quite bad at it.
It's not because we're not taught at school, Malcolm, which I think is a big issue. I mean, I'm trained in listening as well, like you are, but in my everyday life, I do switch off sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if I think to my parents, they did everything they could to make sure that I was brought up properly, but they didn't listen very well, either to me or to each other. So actually that's the grounding that I had growing up. And that's, I think, is fairly typical for many, many people across the country. They grow up in an atmosphere where actually properly listening to people, and not listening, not just waiting for your turn to speak, not waiting until it's time for you to give somebody the answer to the problem that they're describing, but just listening.
And it takes practice, but I think it's because what it does is it validates that we're important, that we're valued when someone listens to us. And it's such a basic skill, but with a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Right, well, we just end it there, Malcolm, but thank you so much.
If you want. No, that's okay.